Yeah, Earth is a pretty special place, but I've read a little bit
Yeah.
about Mars too, and amazing how much of the geological formations that we're learning about there seem similar to Earth with erosion patterns and flooding and sediments and that type of thing.
24-hour days, all of that. Yeah. Day and night, dust storms. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background for people watching who may not be familiar with you, even though I can't imagine that. You must be pretty famous.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Midwest, actually born and raised in a small Mennonite community in southwestern Minnesota. Actually, Christine's relatives are from there too, on one side. And then I went to college near Chicago and then back to graduate school. And I was able to start studying meteorites that are from Mars. And part of my thesis work in the University of Minnesota. Little did I know that that would become my life's work in a sense, to be working on Mars. Then I went out to San Diego and worked for terrestrial geochemistry for a couple of years. And then that job ended suddenly, as described actually in my book. And I started working at Caltech on spacecraft and space missions for NASA, and I've never changed since then. It's been several missions now that I've done, and so that kind of describes the path of my career, anyway.
Well, tell us a little bit more about growing up in rural Minnesota, and that's the same hometown where my mom grew up. And how did you get involved in rockets and space even back then?
Yeah, so I mean, it was the beginning of the space age, and I have an older brother, a younger sister. I was strongly influenced by my older brother, Doug, who was just charismatically interested in anything science when he was a little kid. Still is, of course. And so I just tagged along with him doing many different little scientific adventures as a kid. We got into model rocketry. We started getting the Sky and Telescope magazine, and so we wanted to get a telescope of our own. We actually put together parts of a telescope and mounted it on a fence post just in time for the close approach of Mars when Mariner 9 just got there. And so we were actually sketching the features of Mars from our backyard. And it was just an insatiable curiosity by my brother and myself. And it was partly that we were in this era of the space age with the moon rockets and all of that. And so it was just an absolutely fascinating time to be interested in those kinds of things. I should also say that my small town, and this is before the age of the internet, and it was a farming community. We actually worked on my uncle's farm growing up, and there was not a lot of information about the outside world. And so we could not even get information about a lot of these things except to go to the city library and get these magazines and that's how we got involved. We saw advertisements for model rockets, for telescopes and things like that, and so we would order these things, get involved in variable star observations just as a kid, even though that was for amateur astronomers who were mostly grown-ups. And so we did all of that and just had a lot of fun doing that.
And so, the Southwest Minnesota has a lot of Mennonite churches and communities. Uh, so, are you Mennonite? Is that the? Did you grow up as part of a Mennonite community, or tell us a little bit about your spiritual background?
Yeah, yeah, this town is had a lot of Mennonites. I was from a Mennonite background, more so sort of ethnically than spiritually in a sense. There were people on the street who were still speaking Low German when I was a kid. So it was almost still an immigrant community, like I said, somewhat insulated. But the churches that were part of this Mennonite community were not the kind that eschew any kind of real modern conveniences. It wasn't that way. We did believe in living relatively simply, not getting caught up in issues of this world, and so that was kind of the background. Um, and so I would say the emphasis of our church was almost more like most Protestant churches of that time. And I think maybe just for the listeners, I'll just say that that time in history was a bit different than it is today. And I think we've been profoundly influenced by our culture and by the political forces around us. And in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s, it was the era of the Cold War. And we had an enemy which was building a big arsenal of nuclear weapons, and made no bones about the fact that they wanted to conquer us ideologically, and that this was an atheistic state that, from Karl Marx, religion is an opiate of the people. And so here was this other half of the world building ICBMs to destroy us and bring us over into their ideology, which was atheistic. So here was America with its freedom of religion, wanting to preserve that. And so at that time, it was really actually fairly patriotic to be a Christian. And we talk about in the 20th century, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Of course, there were also many Catholics. But the fact that that is tacked on at the end means that many people were active Christians in that time, more so than now. We actually had I think, the highest church attendance of any time, percentage-wise, in the U.S. history in the 1950s to 1960s. But then come the new century, and in 2001 we were attacked by religious fanatics. And suddenly, and the Cold War was over, and suddenly it's not that we have as an enemy an atheistic state, but rather we have religious people. And so our whole society has changed because of that. And so I think we have to understand that people growing up in this earlier generation, the baby boomer generation, had this kind of very strong overall Christian influence in America at that time that we don't have today so much.
That's fascinating that you mentioned that, Doctor. I do want to ask you a question. There's an ex-Mennonite who goes by the name of Paul Logia on YouTube. He's got a big following, Paul Enns, and he developed an interest, like a lot of young people, in dinosaurs, and was researching dinosaurs when he came to the realization that they probably weren't on Noah's Ark just a few thousand years ago. And this began to eat away at his faith. He kept it private at the time, but he was outed in his community when people found out about it. And now he has fully deconstructed and left the faith, and has a YouTube community online kind of debunking Christianity. But his very first video was "Ken Ham Made Me an Atheist," this idea of young earth creation that he grew up with. You might not have seen a lot of that maybe when you were growing up in that community. Maybe that hasn't been your experience, but in today's circles, that's a growing number of nuns and duns who see Christianity, whether it's Mennonite or even Catholic or Protestant, as anti-science. I don't think COVID has made it better. I think the Christian response in some circles to vaccines and masks has probably made that grow, that distrust in with Christians as far as science goes. You famously wrote an e-document on radiometric dating. Did that have something to do with this friction between what Christians refer to as young earth creation and modern science? And maybe you could talk about people leaving their faith over this dichotomous idea that it's either Genesis is history and science, or we have to choose that godless atheism that you brought up with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, John, I think you've hit on really another really big sort of trend in America over the last 5, 6 decades, because in the 1960s, with the success of the U.S. in World War II, and then going on to the moon and beating the Soviet Union with that, I think there was a lot of trust in science, and people were very interested in learning things. And then slowly, as the decades have rolled since then, it has eroded very much so in American society. And so, along with that, I grew up with this idea that the Bible and science were very congruent. Okay, and so going to the moon and studying the moon at that time was a really cool thing, and it was telling us more about God and about His creation. But as time went along, there became a more and more vocal community within certain parts of the Christendom that started speaking more to, a view that we had to preserve sort of the conservative view of how to understand Scripture. And so they started to say, no, these are literal days, these are literal, very little literal things that the church historically didn't always take that way. In fact, most of history. And so I first found that as I was finishing graduate school, which was on these Martian meteorites, on their ages, all of these things. And then I moved to San Diego from the Midwest. It happened to be a headquarters for some of the organizations that propound this young Earth view out of the Bible. And so I joined a church there, was talking with one of the church leaders a few months after I joined. And this is a person who listened to what I was doing my research on in terrestrial geochemistry, listened for a few minutes, and then just kind of said, no, I think you're wrong. And the reason he thought that is because he had heard a 2-hour seminar by a Christian group. And so this was the start of real misinformation among Christendom, in terms of what does science tell us about many different things. But at that point, geology and things like the age of the Earth, the continents, all of this kind of view. And so that voice has gotten stronger in some circles, kind of pushing a wedge between Christianity, at least in conservative circles, and science. And we have seen the fruit of that now. And it's very unfortunate, because we are to be seeking truth. And truth does not just come from Christians, it comes from non-Christians as well. We do not have a corner on knowledge. And at this point in time, some of the most intelligent people in our world, most of the most intelligent people, I would even say in many cases, are not Christians, and they have a lot to tell us about our universe.
Well, I'm sure you're well aware of that quip from the Russian cosmonaut that when he was orbiting in space and he said he didn't see God, and somebody said if he would have stepped outside his spacesuit, he would have met him. That kind of combative nature between theists and atheists, though, it might have been blunted a little bit in recent times, but there are still a lot of people in the scientific community probably that might do a double take when they find out you're a devout Christian. What has your experience been in the science field as far as acceptance of your faith? And was there ever a time in your life as you were gaining this knowledge in school and in your work that you ever had any philosophical doubts or theological doubts about your faith?
Okay, well, I guess I'll answer the last one first, just briefly, and then I'll go on to the first part. I think I'm theological doubts. I would have to say I've not gone through any deep times of not being there. I tend to be frustrated or angry at God at times because He he has not given the human race more wisdom, more knowledge, and so we blunder about as we do so much. But I look at Jesus in the New Testament getting upset and weeping over Jerusalem for much the same reason, I think. So it's probably a common theme. Now, how does my faith work out with the scientific community? I have to say that the scientific community is very interested in science, and they want to know, do we accept the findings that they are finding, or not, or do we disagree with them? And that's the main thing. And so I have not been given that hard of a time by very many people at all in terms of my faith. But I can say, for example, I had something on the internet and it referred to the fact that I was at Caltech a long time back, and the department said, please take our name off of that, things like that. But other than that, it's like I said, the real interest is in science. Now, within that, I think that we, as Christians and the Christian community, ought to be interested in science. I've sort of already said that, but let me refer to Philippians 4:8, which says, "Whatever things are true, think on these things." And there are many places in the Bible where people who study are commended, and so we need to be aware of that. And I think more of our society needs to be taught not facts, but how do we know what is the truth and what is falsehood? If we have two competing stories, which one do we trust and why? That's an important lesson that we have for our next generation and for ourselves in today's environment.
Yeah. So did that factor into the article that you wrote for the American Scientific Affiliation on radiometric dating? The idea of
Yes.
wanting to provide truthful information for the Christian community about how radiometric dating works and if it's reliable?
Yes, Christine. So when I started coming up against this idea that we should not trust scientific findings, and that the Bible was against that in some way, then I started trying to see what I could do to change those or to argue against that. And so I worked with an organization called the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a group of Christian believers who are in the sciences. And they were interested in publishing a little pamphlet or booklet that would talk about radiometric dating and explain it so that people could understand more about it. So I wrote that and submitted it. We had it reviewed by a number of people, and it has a lot of references to scripture in it as well. And unfortunately, they didn't have the money to do a big publication run. This was a long time ago. It was at the very beginning of the internet, and so they said, "Well, we're just starting to get onto the internet, so we'll put your pamphlet online." And so I thought, okay, good. Well, maybe I won't see it again because I can't hand this out. I can't pass it out. And then a couple of years later, I started getting a huge amount of mail because what happened was this was the beginning of internet, and Yahoo picked it up. Radiometric dating was the number one site for anything going to radiometric dating. And so there were many people. And so for years, a number of years, any scientific conference that I went to, many professors, non-Christians, Christians alike, would come up to me and say, "Thank you for writing this and getting it online so that Christians who are in my class who are wondering about this can have this information." And so that's exactly why I wrote it. And a lot of people have benefited from that. It had a readership annually of about 40,000 people for many years.
And
Oh,
we
yeah, it's
have
a
the
really
link to
excellent
that,
article.
folks. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, the link to that free ebook, it comes in either HTML or PDF. based on a
Yeah.
press of a button is there. You can review it yourself or share it with a friend, which leads me to this question that wasn't scripted, Doctor, and that is Christians are pretty good at math. But it seems like at least the corner of Christendom needs remedial science. The fact that you had to write a Christian approach to radiometric dating was most likely to correct bad information that's being disseminated by those in the young earth creation movement. So why do you think that Christians stumble in this area? Why is it science that seems to be a stumbling block to at least a corner of of the family of God?
I'm going to answer it this way and just say the same was true in Jesus' time. Not about science, but about religion and how to deal with Scripture. And in the Bible times of the New Testament, there was a relatively well-known group of religious people called the Pharisees, and there was also other ones as well. But their big emphasis, as we see in the Bible, in the Gospels and in Acts, is on keeping the Scriptures as pure as possible, making sure that we have enough rules, that we're conservative enough, that we're doing exactly what God wants us to and more. And so I think that that kind of emphasis is still in Christendom today. In fact, I think if you walk into any church today, there are two religions that are being espoused in that church, and I don't say this too lightly, because of course we want to worship God, but there is another religion that is often present, and that is traditionalism, and it is something to say we need to protect the way we have been, or to make sure that people don't reinterpret things in some way that would be more liberal, or in some way that we think would be wrong, and so that's actually a very good thing in many senses, but in some it goes too far. And in the biblical times, the Pharisees went too far. They didn't care about their relationship with God as much as they cared about keeping the rules. And I believe that in our zeal for trying to serve God in the modern church today as well, and keep the Scriptures pure, some people have gone too far in terms of over-interpreting Scripture in a more conservative way that it needs to be, and throwing out other things. And we see that with people in other ways as well. In the last century, we have gone away from the horse and buggy, and yet there are groups of Christians who still use horses and buggies as their way of getting around. We call them Amish, or there's other people as well. And so there's nothing wrong, I don't believe, with driving a car. And I think that's almost all of us that believe that way. But they have stayed with horses and buggies. Now, I feel as if we have done much the same thing with science in our churches today. We have left behind modern science and stayed with the horse and buggy instead of going with it, just to make sure that we are stronger on the side of conservatism, to make sure everything is great. But that causes problems, as we know.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. So your initial article was a long time ago, and you have a more recent article, well, chapter maybe, that's in this wonderful book, The Grand Canyon, Monument to an Ancient Earth, where you wrote up the radiometric dating chapter in this book as well. This book is
So
just
this
now
book
about
was
5 years
published.
old. Yeah.
Yeah, 5 years ago. I finally found my copy. We just moved, so it was a little hard to find it. This is, I think, an important book because of the idea that some of the people in this young Earth community had, that somehow everything had to have been made within the last 5,000 years, which is tremendous bunk if you are a geologist. It's you can pick up a pebble off the ground, and it's been rounded over 5,000 years for sure. I mean, that just makes total sense. And this idea, even with the Grand Canyon and tours there, suggesting, this or that happened, and trying to throw doubt on the science that that is pretty obvious from the Grand Canyon, and all the way down to the very hard basalt rock at the bottom that has taken a long time to be carved there. And so this book was a long time in the making, actually, but it was published around 2016 by Kregel, and you can get it today. And it talks about the two different views of the Grand Canyon and why it is important that we understand the science behind how the Grand Canyon was formed. So there was one chapter in that book that is talking about the radiometric ages in geology in general and in the Grand Canyon specifically. And so I contributed that chapter with a little bit of help from some of the people who are real experts on the Grand Canyon.
It's just a beautiful book too. It's filled with just wonderful color pictures and diagrams, and so I recommend, if anybody's looking for a lovely coffee table type book that's very informative and interesting, I just highly recommend it. Makes a lovely Christmas present too. Just Christmas is coming.
Yeah,
and then you have this other book too.
Okay, yeah, let's
Red
move
Rover,
to that one.
that's about some of your work on Mars rovers. So I think we should probably talk about that next. Let's well, why don't we start by asking how is the geology on Mars and what you're learning about Mars similar or different from what we know about the Grand Canyon?
Yeah, Mars is a sister planet to the Earth in a sense. From what we understand of our solar system, all of the planets were created and formed about the same time, a very long time ago. So basically, actually, one very nice help in thinking about this is a picture from the Hubble telescope. And you might be familiar with it. It is actually titled, many places it's titled Pillars of Creation. And it has these gas and dust clouds that the Hubble telescope is seeing. And there are some little stars blinking out just of the edges of these huge billowing gas clouds out in deep space. And that speaks to how the solar system forms. And so actually I'll go to the beginning of this book, which is talking about an earlier mission that I was involved in. And so the book starts with, and I've got the copy here, the book starts actually with this mission by NASA called Genesis. And so I got involved with that in the 1990s. It flew in space from 2001 to 2004. And its job was to collect particles from the sun, solar wind, to try to understand more about the creation of our solar system and that time when this cloud of gas and dust came into becoming the sun and planets. Now, more than 99% of the material in our solar system is locked up in the sun. And so if we want to understand the composition of our solar system, we need to understand that of the sun. And so we were out to actually collect solar wind particles and to bring them back to Earth for better study. We did know a fair amount about the sun's composition, but in particular, we wanted to know about isotopes. And they would tell us some things about the makeup of our solar system that we don't understand just from the elements. And in fact, if we study weather on the Earth, isotopes tell us a little bit even about where water comes from in rainwater. So that's how important isotopes are for studying these kinds of things. So I'm going on a long digression with this book, but the first few chapters actually show, if I can show this, this is the spacecraft and what happened to it with an amazingly terrible crash in the Utah desert back in 2004, and I was there. But so NASA was billing or I should say the media was billing this as a terrible disaster. I knew that we had gotten our samples back when this thing crashed to Earth instead of the parachute coming out and it descending slowly and getting picked up by a helicopter. So that was the first of several really amazing things that I had to write about. And that same year, I got picked up from our proposal to get onto the Curiosity rover. And so the rest of this book is then follows my career into the Curiosity rover, how we got selected for this instrument that we call ChemCam, this laser instrument that zaps rocks, and then also how our development went. We at one point got canceled again by NASA, went through a real time of, you could even say, soul searching, and then got reinstated, and then eventually landed safely on Mars, and have done this all of this great exploration. So that's sort of the gist of the book. Now, to get to your last part of your question on what is Mars like, I'll just go on and just say that Mars is a sister planet to Earth. Mars is actually in the solar system's habitable zone. So if Mars was a little bit different in its makeup, Mars could very easily harbor life. And so that's a very important thing to realize and think about. Now, Mars is only 1/10 the mass of Earth, and so it doesn't have as much gravity, only 38% as much on the surface. And so what has happened is that over time, over several billion years, Mars has lost its atmosphere. It only has 1% as thick an atmosphere now as the Earth. And because of that, it is now a relatively inhospitable place relative to what it used to be when it had its atmosphere and when it had lakes and rivers and oceans. And so that is what we are interested in studying, to try to understand not only the climate on Mars and how that changed, but to really see if Mars harbored life back when it was habitable. And that's just a very fascinating line of study that is an important aspect of NASA right now. And I'm just loving it.
There's a little overlap with what you just suggested, and that is that in the group that we previously discussed that struggles with modern science also seems to be dead set against the idea that there is life outside of the planet Earth. And it's a theological reason, I think, that they conclude that. It would probably be devastating to a chunk of them to find out that there was life out there other than on our own planet. Would it affect your faith at all, sir, or how do you see that conversation?
I think it would be absolutely exciting and fascinating. Nothing about finding life elsewhere would shake my faith, unless they had some other story that had a different spiritual bent that would be very different and somehow antithetical, which I think would be very interesting if there was actually a knowledgeable or conscious life, I should say. But basically, the idea that God could have created life elsewhere is, I think, very important. We need to understand that. One of the things that we have held near and dear to us, I could say, or Christendom has held near and dear to it, is an egocentrism. And I think part of the reason that many Christians or many people embrace this idea, that sort of anti-science idea, is they like to think that they know better, even if they haven't really spent years studying this. There's an egocentrism that we often tend to have. So this has been present throughout church history. If you go to certain parts of Europe, you will find in certain few cathedrals in Europe from the 1500s, images of a geocentric solar system on the walls of painted on the wall somewhere, because it's part of their education, right? That we are the center of God's universe. Well, no, actually we're not. And so we all acknowledge that in a sense. We're the third planet from the sun, and everybody knows, pretty much everyone knows that now, that the sun is our center of our solar system. But the sun isn't the center of the universe either. It's in the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy. I mean, that's not the center of the galaxy at all, and we're very grateful that it's not. And then our galaxy isn't at the center of the universe either. It's in a cluster of galaxies, the Virgo cluster. And then we can go on from there. And because this cluster is going towards the great attractor, And so we have these some 100 or billions anyway of galaxies in the universe. And if you want to think about this sometime, Google map of the universe and start to think about that. So there's a little bit of a digression, but there is a lot out there. And if we read scripture correctly, God created the universe for his creativity, for his pleasure, not for us. We are a part of it, and we have a special place in God's heart. But it doesn't say that we are the only life or that we should be. And this has been actually emphasized by thinking Christians for a long time. Many of us are familiar with C.S. Lewis from the first half of the 20th century, a very articulate person, a writer and thinker. And he wrote some great science fiction, but he also wrote an essay called Of Religion and Rocketry, talking about the fact that God could have created life elsewhere. We may find it sometime. And so we can be reminded of that from time to time. It's important.
I was thinking of when the first pictures came back from the Perseverance rover when it landed in March, and I saw a couple different memes. I saw one of Bernie sitting on Mars when all the Bernie memes, mitten memes were going around, and one of the little Bugs Bunny and that little Martian peeking in at the camera on Perseverance. And so it's been really fun to see pictures come back. And you recently had an article you wrote about the findings that you're discovering on Mars. Tell us about what you're learning. What's some of the neat things that we're discovering and learning about from Mars?
Yeah, so we are in a crater called Jezero Crater with this Perseverance rover. It's about the size of Lake Tahoe, and it was once a lake. We have a delta formation, a geologic formation that has captured sort of the meanders of the river. It is emptying silt into the lake there. And so we knew this was a lake at one time. And this actually follows the Curiosity rover, which landed a decade ago now, almost exactly, or was launched exactly a decade ago within the month. And Curiosity went to a larger crater that at the time, 10 years ago, people were unsure if it was really a lake or not. And we showed very clearly that it was a lake. It had clay minerals in the silt that was deposited there, so the material had been altered by being in the water for a long period of time. And we went up over 1,000 feet in elevation, climbing side of a hill in the center of this crater lake. And this material had been eroded away, so we were actually seeing lake bed sediments millimeter by millimeter as we climbed up this 1,000 feet. So you can start to count those up, assuming those are yearly deposits. This then goes to about 1 million years, and we can go on from there. I mean, it may have been somewhat episodic, but at least much of it was for probably one period of time, because we don't see evidence of that much evidence of it drying out in between. Okay, so we knew about long-lived lakes on Mars from Curiosity, and now we are with Perseverance. We're here in Jezero Crater, and we have this delta formation. And not only is there inlets to Jezero Crater, there's also an outlet channel. And so one might think that now we have a stable lake, that it doesn't, you can have lakes like the Great Salt Lake that don't have any outlet, and their actual levels can increase and decrease quite a lot over time. There's ancient lakes that was much larger than the current Salt Lake, and so on. But we would have thought that Jezero Crater's lake would have been stable with this outlet. It turns out that some of the very first pictures that we got, we took the SuperCam camera, which had never been focused at infinity to take a picture, because we'd always been indoors, and this is a long-range camera, always indoors when we were testing the instrument on Earth before launch. So here it is outdoors, finally on Mars, day 26 of the mission, and we take a mosaic of the Delta Formation. Didn't know what our resolution would look like, but this camera got crystal clear images. It really shocked us how good it was, if I can boast just a little bit. And that was a little miracle in itself. But anyway, looking at this delta formation, you would expect a lot of nice siltstone going all the way down, very fine-grained rock. And here, lo and behold, are boulders halfway down. How do boulders get into a delta formation? Imagine now the Mississippi River, and you're in the Gulf of Mexico, and you're out at sea even a little ways where where all of this material is being deposited. You don't have boulders there. What happened on Mars must have been a huge flash flood to bring cobbles, stones, and boulders downstream at some point in time. And so now we're actually understanding that, hey, this climate at least once had a big flash flood for some reason. And so we're having a lot more interesting fun really understanding or trying to learn how stable this lake was, how long was it there, and things like that.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you're going to keep gathering. We're just at the beginning of the Perseverance's life of gathering information and sending it back. So there's going to be a lot that we learn coming up. But you're probably not just like only looking at collected data. You're probably on to the next thing. What's next on your horizon that you can tell us about?
Oh gosh, I am terribly busy with the current missions.
Okay.
So I'll say that. Of course, yeah, there is always the future, and so we are looking at what could we do next. NASA is for Mars looking at bringing samples back. So the purpose, or one of the main purposes of this Perseverance rover, which by the way is about the size of a car, is to actually collect rock samples that we could bring back to Earth. If we ever want to get humans to Mars, we want to be able to bring something else back first. So that's one reason. And the other reason is very strongly scientific, that there are many things that we can do with the sample back on Earth that we cannot do with the instruments on Mars, much as we like them and as much as we like to boast about them. So this Perseverance rover is drilling samples. It has a hollow drill. It is drilling into the rocks, collecting cylindrical samples that go into metal tubes that are capped at the ends. The rover is holding them and carrying them around. We have 2 of them ready, and we're going to collect up to 38 of them. And we're going to start to drop them on the ground at some point, probably in a couple of different places to give a couple of different options. And meanwhile, NASA is now working on an ascent rocket that will launch off of the surface of Mars with these samples and get them into low orbit and then eventually back to Earth. So we're not a part of that necessarily, because I like to build the instruments to study the science on Mars. So what can we do next on Mars with science and instrumentation? We're looking at Ingenuity, the helicopter, which was flown and still is flying on Mars. It's flown 14 flights, and I think we're getting ready for a 15th flight. So it came mounted on the belly of the rover. It's pretty small, but NASA, and at least some people at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, are looking at what could we do now if we scaled that up to actually have its own science payload and have its own mission. So we're looking at miniaturizing some of our instruments to be very lightweight and very small, much smaller than on this car-sized rover, and getting them into really inaccessible places on Mars, possibly even like a Mars cave. So I've been working on several different instrument concepts for that.
I'm curious, Doctor. One of the things that really struck me when I read your book, because I had really no understanding of how NASA works, but just how competitive it is to be selected for a mission. And you said it was I don't think you said soul searching. It seemed more to me like soul crushing to get close and then be denied or rejected. And I'm just wondering, of course you've had the agony of defeat and the glory of the being selected. It reminded me of almost like a beauty pageant, though, the way you have to present your ideas and hope to get a call back. But crossing over to this idea, you talk about NASA's plans. We're living in an age right now where it's not just NASA who has plans, it's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and so forth. And I'm just curious if you think that the kind of private sector space missions, do you think that's an overall plus going forward, or is there some friction there between NASA and the private companies?
Yeah, that's a great and interesting question, John. I think our country is made of capitalism, and I mean it's much better than the alternative. And so yes, government has been at the forefront of a lot of space exploration, and that's partly because it's very tough to get there. But private industry is a great is important to have capitalism in competition. You did mention that actually the selection of instruments for these rovers is, in a sense, capitalism, because they are selected by, well, you could say a beauty pageant, by a contest. And so there is a huge amount of competition. We never know, we never even dare to dream that we're going to be on the next mission when we put in a proposal. And because there's so much competition, and there are private industries that are doing this. We work a lot, although I work at a government lab, we work a lot with private industry to do many of the tasks that we have to do. But in terms of the big players, the Bezos and Musk, it's exciting because they can dream big now and start to work into these space missions, be it space tourism or contracting with NASA or contracting with private industry to get satellites up there. So it's great. And I love to see all these different ideas. They are so creative, and they have brought us forward technologically so well. I mean, the landing back of the booster stages and reusing them. So it is a great era to live in and to watch all of this. We do have to be a little careful because unbridled capitalism sometimes can start to make a mess of things in terms of be it pollution or whatever, things like that. And so we do have to watch out a little bit that we don't say fill all of space with junk or things like that. And so there should be some checks and balances that help with that. So I hope that is the case.
Yeah, so I want to kind of touch on that aspect. And it seems to me that when we have this significant segment of Christianity stuck in a war against science and holding almost fringe ideas on what the universe around us is like, we're really missing an opportunity for the Christian community to be involved in ethical decisions that are inherent in the scientific process. How do we have good policies on space junk and pollution and like ethics in biology and cloning and CRISPR and all the different upcoming technologies as it continues to advance? We need Christian presence in making ethical decisions. And how do you see the Christian community becoming involved if so many are, centuries behind in their understanding of reality?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christine. And I think one way to look at this, I really try to understand things in the big picture way, culturally as well. And one of the things is that our society was a sort of dominant Christian in decades past, and it's not really now. And it's sort of, I think the sense is that it's gone down fighting. That it's saying no, listen, or we are the only answer, this kind of thing. And that's what you hear in a lot of these kind of ministries. And it's unfortunate because all truth is God's truth, whether it is from Christians or non-Christians. And so we need to be aware of that. But So many Christians have lost their voice in the public square because of that, in Christendom in general, in some sense. But that's not to, but don't give up hope, I would say. There are many people out there who are doing amazing things, and there are people who are in leadership, and we should be aware of them. For example, I'll just give one example here. Francis Collins is the head of the National Institutes of Health. He is a very outspoken Christian, and he controls the funding for all of our health funding in the United States. So that's a real big important position to be in. We should be aware of him. We should be aware of others like him who are in these positions of authority and doing great things. We have to be dialoguing with intellectual people, whether they are Christians or not. That's it is the role that people play, and where what they can do. That is really important in that sense, and so that is where we should be.
I definitely agree with that. I just have that hasn't really been my experience though. My experience has been more of a dichotomy that um, Christians a lot of them, a lot that I've met in my circle have a very almost visceral reaction to discussions like about evolution or science topics. And what would be your advice to like youth pastors and youth leaders and I mean, adult pastors too, for how to bring about a dialogue that allows Christians to have conversations on these topics?
Yeah, I think we need to restore, in some senses, perhaps a sense of humility among ourselves. I think that is, as I said, in a sense, going down fighting. That is not a perspective of humility. That is not a fruit of the spirit that we read in scriptures. And I think if we are not an expert in some area, I think that looking at what what various people have to say and listening is important. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the important things that we, as a society, need to learn better is how to understand truth from falsehood, from misinformation. And there are actually, I mean, we can even speak politically. There are foreign forces that are actually trying to provide us with misinformation too, by the way. So how do we understand truth from falsehood? And that is, I think, a very important thing. Look at the source, and the source. Uh, there's one of the problems I think we have had is that some Christians tend to disbelieve non-Christians, thinking that there is a chip on their shoulder or something like that. There are many people that are searching for truth in a scientific sense, and that does not necessarily have to bolster their particular outlook. And so I think that we need to look at um, how we can understand whether people should be trusted, whether they are Christians or not, and that's an important aspect. And we need to be a bit more open to and having more humility towards each other.
I'm
Yeah, I don't know. I
interested.
think that they don't even trust Christians who have experts. I mean, I can bring up um, my studying of how the signals from space pass through the ionosphere and the effects of anomalies on the time it takes for that signal to reach Earth, and they'll just like, that's not true.
Yeah, it's
Well,
unfortunate.
partly that shows that information isn't what they're looking for. That is an
Right.
emotional investment they have in their presuppositions there, and so I've had conversations with people like that. Just you, the information goes in one ear and out the other. It's not weighed. It's not trusted,
Well, that's
and
just
so
your opinion. I
yeah,
have a different opinion, and
yeah,
my opinion is just as good as yours, even though I know nothing about it.
yeah. There is a suspicion, at least with modern Christians in the West here, there seems to be a suspicion not just of science, but also of government and of certainly of
Doctors,
journalism. And so when all
vaccines.
three of those entities are telling you to wear a mask and get a vaccine, and some of their own spiritual voices are saying don't, that it's, some kind of kneeling to Nebuchadnezzar or something. If you do, then you're going to have that kind of battle. I'm interested in this question for you, Doctor, and that is usually there's three. There may be more ways to view this question that we've been talking about faith and science. And some people see it as incompatible, that they're hostile to one another, that dichotomous view that Christine brought up earlier. Others see that it could be complementary or at least compatible. And then Stephen Jay Gould famously argued for non-overlapping magisteria, that they're really two different conversations and they don't belong together. I'm curious, what is your own point of view on that?
Yeah, this idea of noma, it goes it works in some directions, some things, but it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't work in the end, and that's certainly my fairly strong view on that. And I'll explain why. So you can say, well, uh, maybe we can't study the miracles of the Bible, so that's not interlapping. We don't have to worry about that, and so you can accept them, and so on. But then what about what happens after we die? And if there is a resurrection, if there is life after death, then that's very important for us. If there is not, it's not. And so you can't have this kind of non-overlapping. One is true or the other is true, and they have strong and profound implications for us in our lives. So I don't buy that. What I buy in terms of understanding the realm of science and the realm of the Bible is that God has spoken to people who wrote down the scriptures, and he spoke to them in their own language. And part of that language is their culture, a big part of that language. And if we pull out the Bible in the 20th, first century, read it in English or whatever our favorite language is that is not Hebrew or Greek, especially Hebrew, it is very different. We are reading something, and Protestant Christians are encouraged to read our Bible every day. But what we are reading is something that is, on one level, understandable. We can understand the spiritual aspect, our need for the relationship with God. What we often don't understand is the cultural aspects. And the farther back we go in time in the Bible, the harder it is to understand that culture. And some of what's happened is, again, this idea of defaulting to the most conservative view that has taken place in translations of our Bible throughout time. I mean, there was a time when there were no translations of the Bible besides Latin. But when the Bible started to be translated into people's own language after the Reformation, certain things kind of got captured at that point, and they froze in time. And meanwhile, our language and our view of the universe has changed. And all of us accept that we're not the center of the solar system, and so on. When people ask me about a global flood in Genesis, I say, what globe? Because there was no globe of the earth. That only happened recently. And so the Hebrew word for all of the earth is the same as all of the land, right? And so, but we have this word translated earth that could be translated land. The flood was over all of the land. And so our view, like I said, our view of our definition or our use of the word earth has changed. It used to be the same as land. Okay, it was a region around us, and now it means a globe. So these things have changed out from under us. And so if we start to understand that, and actually I'm very happy that you interviewed another, at least one more important person in this whole dialogue, John Walton, who was a professor of Old Testament and at Wheaton College, and he has written a number of books, Understanding the Lost World of Genesis and so on. And as a Hebrew scholar, he can speak to those things very intelligently. And so that is where Christendom needs to go back to if we want to understand our concordance with science. And so that's, I hope that answers your question appropriately.
No, I think that's really great. We appreciate you. We're about up at an hour now. So just one final question. If someone was discouraged or frustrated because they are struggling to reconcile their science with their faith, what kind of encouragement would you offer?
Well, I would just say that we are spiritual beings and we need that aspect to us. I'll give a little example. I entered graduate school in physics. I went and got a PhD in physics, which deals with the subatomic, with the very fundamental details of nature. I'm now in geology a lot, but anyway, it was a very interesting time for me and very formative. But I think people have to be quite intelligent to go through graduate school in physics. Somehow I made it. But anyway, some of my colleagues, they didn't fare as well, and part of it I think was the spiritual grounding. I certainly knew at least one who went through a mental nervous breakdown. Went back to his home country. I think there were at least several of those. But there was another person who I was studying with for the qualifiers, and he was very intelligent, and the professors recognized that. But he also he took a nihilistic view, and and so going out for drinks after studying together for the qualifier, I started to learn more about this. And his view was, yeah, there is no God, there is no moral absolutes, and it really means I can do what I want. I'm not answerable to anyone, and that's that is certainly a strong possible philosophical outlook if you are not in with moral absolutes of Christianity. And so he was. I mean, a number of people, many people in our society have that view, but they don't live it out. Thank God. He did. And so he was very interested in a young woman who was also a graduate student, but she ended up moving in with another guy. He killed her. He killed the guy, but nobody knew what had happened. Nobody knew that it was him. This graduate student was murdered. It was a terrible tragedy in the department. But then he thought he had another chance at this girl. But she ended up being interested in somebody else, moving in again. At this point, he started to go a little crazy because this big effort that he had done, now having to stay with this hidden crime, now this was a big thing weighing on his conscience, and we do have moral compasses, and there are moral absolutes, and as we go into this, if we go the other route, it is not to our good, because God has made us with a spiritual side, and so you can see the outcomes of these things, and he suffered the consequences. And I mean, not everybody does that, but there is a void that we need God to fill in our lives.
Oh, we thank you so much for your time. And just as a reminder, there's the Red Rover book that's about the robotic missions, both to collect particles from the sun and the Curiosity rover.
Oops.
And there's the Grand Canyon book, written by multiple authors, that includes a chapter on radiometric dating. And these are both excellent books, very interesting, fun to read. And the Grand Canyon book in particular is just a beautiful, lovely book. So we thank you so much for your time today, and really glad you could join us.
Thank you.